Everyone's favorite video of the month is back. It is time to pretend that playing a lot of card games makes me able to predict the future. Let's rate every card in this season. And this is a particularly difficult season, even among what I think you could describe as some generally difficult seasons. This season has a ton of cards that are very specific, and so it'll be not just rating how good I think the cards are, but whether or not those cards will end up good enough to make their archetypes strong. Star-Lord is an interesting case. This card looks like it goes in 3 major potential archetypes. Archetype number 1 is High Evolutionary. Archetype number 2 is something looking to duplicate the effects of Star-Lord, i.e. with things like Absorbing Man and Grandmaster, potentially as a subset of High Evolutionary. Archetype number 3 is duplicating the effects of Star-Lord via a symbiote Spider-Man, likely in the Fin Fang Foom Man-Spider decks. So I have to figure out whether I think this card is good enough to justify being in those decks in the first place, and I think the answer is yes, and then whether those decks are going to end up being good enough to justify their own existences. My instinct is this card is pretty good, though. I think that this is one of the better cards in this season, potentially the best card in this season. It does enough interesting and dynamic things and hooks into enough ways to multiply its own effect, which is something I've been really looking for in new cards. Good ways to multiply their effects. I think Show Lao is a great example of how this can take a card with an already good effect and magnify it into something that is potentially broken. The ways to multiply Show Lao's effect are probably a little bit better, especially Maverick, given what that card was going into the season before it got nerfed. One of the best cards in the game already. The cards that work with this are not nearly so incredible. Cards like Absorbing Man and Grandmaster and Symbiote Spider-Man are fine. They're good enough cards, but certainly not on the level of Maverick. But they do give this card a dimension that is beyond simply jamming him in High Evolutionary and playing him for the minimum possible outcome. This does mean that there are ways that this card is going to be able to take over games. There are going to be games that are going to be defined by this card and then the multiplication of its effect. I don't think this card is as good as Show Lao, but I do think that it is a reasonable enough card that I am torn between a 3.5-star rating and a 4-star rating. I'm going to assume that I'm potentially a little bit low on this card, and I am going to give it a 4-star rating. Magus is a 3/5 with an activate ability that looks at your unspent energy for the turn and copies a card's text in the deck with its cost equal to that unspent energy. Quite a mouthful, but there are 2 types of cards that this explicitly does not work with. It explicitly does not work with activate cards because it has already been activated were it to copy one, so you would not be able to activate the card you copied, and of course it explicitly does not work with on reveals as they changed the text to indicate, which leaves this card in a bit of an interesting position. I expect it to probably be bad, but it'll be bad in interesting and useful ways. Like, there are going to be some interesting decks that do what Magus wants to do, but I don't know that they're going to be all that good. If this card has a saving grace, it's its basic stat line of 3/5. That actually is just a very reasonable stat line for a 3-cost card with potential upside to have, and I don't really see a lot that suggests that that is an unfair stat line for this card to have. I think it is a reasonable card at this stat line. I just don't know that it's going to really break out, be exciting, do a lot, and similarly, I also don't know that it has a lot of room to go up. Like, if they want to make this card stronger, could they make it a 3/6? Is that a reasonable design decision? My instinct is that it probably isn't, which makes me think that this is a card that has a fairly high cap on what it's able to be in the future. Any changes that they could do to this sort of feel to me like maybe bad design decisions, which means that this is not a card that I think has sort of Lin Lee or Dragon of the Moon potential where they might actually make it stronger. I think this guy's just going to be what he is. A little bit of a weirdo that you're not upset to have in your collection, but you're probably not going out of your way to go and acquire. I think that that is a very meaningful distinction here. This card is fine, but it's definitely not something that I think you're going to be super excited to pick up. An analogy would almost be, I think, a card like Headpool, where Headpool is this card that is like, it's doing a very specific thing, much like Magus, who is doing either I am copying an ongoing card in your deck, or I am copying the ability of like a really cheap one cost like Misty Knight off High Evolutionary or Sunspot. Neither of those are particularly compelling, but they do things. I do think that that's generally the space this guy ends up in. It's possible you end up doing some weirdo stuff. Like I saw Big Baby messing around with a Warlock deck that was skipping on 5 in order to use this to copy a Devil Dinosaur. It seems like a whole lot of effort, but it is quite funny. That kind of stuff is available, but mostly I think this is a card that is like copying an Iron Man or whatever in your Living Tribunal deck. It's like your Iron Lad type card kind of deal. It's doing that kind of thing. I don't even know if that's going to be enough, but it is a thing that is possible. And then beyond that, I'm not really sure what it's doing outside of copying the things that want you to do certain things like skip 1 energy every turn, since it's naturally going to work with those. I do think the stat line is pretty good, but ultimately I am going to give Magus 2 stars. When I talk about the factors that make it hard to predict the future and do these videos, Moondragon's a great example of it. The famous mistake in various things of the, the card rating video grandfather, that being Trump SC. His famous card rating whiff was rating every priest card in the Ungoro expansion 1 star because priest won't see play, and that being dead wrong. But that's sort of the fundamental problem with doing this kind of Nostradamus-esque stuff, is you get these cards that are very specifically archetype driven, you misevaluate how good that archetype is going to be and what things will happen in the future, and then because you misevaluated how good that archetype is going to be, you give a lot of terrible ratings to cards that aren't that terrible, but in your understanding of what the metagame was going to be, would have been unplayable. That is a very reasonable mistake to make, and he gets clowned for it to this day. This is 10 years later, 12 years later. I don't actually know. It's a long time. Moondragon is a good example of a card like that. And Moondragon is a card that is only doing one thing. It is only ever going to be good in one position of that thing. You are playing this card on turn 2 where you are never playing it. You are going to get about 14 points of power out of it if you are able to do that and finish the rest of what this deck, the quest of this card is asking you to do. That is a reasonable amount of power output, maybe even an extremely powerful amount of power output. The comparison I'd like to make here is Chamber. Chamber is a card that came out and immediately redefined what a ramp deck could be. This is honestly pretty similar. It is Chamber for Doom 2099 decks. Doom 2099 decks are decks that are similar output in terms of what they are doing in terms of ramp. We're playing 1 card a turn, but rather than using the extra energy from an Electro to make those cards bigger, it instead used Doom 2099 and now Moondragon to gain additional power from the fact that they are playing 1 card a turn. These are typically different from ramp decks. Like, you might see people doing Electro Doom 2099, but just because Doom 2099 is a 4-cost card, it makes it very sort of awkward for you to play him in a ramp deck. They tend to be a little more forgiving when you whiff, but at the same time, they do lack a second Doom 2099, meaning that your games with him and your games without him are very notable. Moondragon can be a sort of smaller Doom 2099 and enable you to have a real game plan when you don't draw the card. I do think that that is a good thing. I'm not confident that Doom 2099 and this archetype is a good deck. The comparison to Chamber is apt, I think, but I do think also that Chamber is stronger. It is a better card. It is slightly more flexible and likely more powerful. And more than anything else, it enables a specific playline of stacking 1 lane to get to about 30-something power that deck really benefits from. I don't think that this deck, the Doom 2099 deck, benefits from Moondragon in a similar way that the ramp deck benefited from Chamber. It's going to be worse comparatively to what the ramp deck got. Now, is it going to be enough, though, is the actual question. And I wouldn't be surprised if this meant that you were going to be seeing some Doom 2099 stuff, and I wouldn't be surprised if you lost to some Doom 2099 stuff. The fundamental nature of Marvel Snap is that if you're doing enough points, are kind of going to be in a lot of games. Doom 2099's fatal flaws are always a lack of interactivity on the back end, and if it is a big deck, it just kind of constantly gets blown out by combo decks. It is only ever going to be as good as the points it is making are in the context of a metagame, and we're actually in a fairly combo-heavy metagame, which makes me think we're a little bit hostile to a Doom 2099 style deck. This is a long way of saying that I think Moondragon is a good addition to this deck and is going to be played in this deck and is going to be played literally nowhere else. And that makes her hard to rate because it means the only thing I'm doing is telling you how good I think the Doom 2099 deck is. And I think it's okay. So I'm going to give Moondragon 3 stars. Drax, Avatar of Life, 3/4 end of turn, gain +3 power if your opponent played a bigger card than Drax, then move to that location. The end of turn text on here makes this, I think, the best of the pseudo Captain Marvels they've released in the last few months, especially compared to something like Zombie Captain Marvel. This being end of turn gets rid of all her wacky priority stuff. I do think this card is going to be pretty good. Now, maybe I'm overrating a card that I look at and I see 3/7 with upside. That is the exact kind of card that I would overrate. It is very up my alley. It is very not good in a combo meta. There are going to be metagames where this is bad. But to me, I see this card and I see a very relevant mid-range card that I will want to pick up in the near future. Now, this is a card that I kind of feel like I need a sanity check on because everyone I've talked to about this, they have told me, I don't really know what you're seeing here. I see a card that instantly beats a ramp deck. I see a 3/7 with notable upside. I see a good body with like an almost Shang-Chi type effect on against certain lists. The fact that it's only moving if you'd win that location is such a big deal. Like, I don't know. It's hard for me to not look at this and see like 3/7 to 3/10 Captain Marvel. That's what I see when I see this card. And I look at this and I'm like, I don't know how this can possibly be bad. But nobody else seems to see what I'm seeing. And I gotta assume that this is one of those the situations where I am just way out over my skis. So instead of like going whole hog on Drax, I'm going to say this is going to be a 4-star card, hedge a little bit against my own overreactions. And I will also say, I think there are very good reasons not to believe in this card. Most of them are related to the kind of metagame we're in. In a world where people were still playing like really small guys a lot of the time, a 3/7 Captain Marvel was a lot better in that world where 7 points is winning a lane. In a world where people are comboing off, I don't think a 3/7 Captain Marvel does a damn thing against, say, I don't know, Man Spider or whatever real combo thing you're doing. Oh yeah, your Captain Marvel's 16 power, but I played a Fin Fang Foom and it's 30. All right, cool. Nice. Great job. That kind of stuff is interesting, but I would not be surprised if I were like at least trying this in some sort of Batroc Sam Craven list. I would not be surprised if I saw it in a lot of different mid-range decks. I think it is just a very solid card. I think this is a 4-star card for me. Major Victory, a 3/4 that adds 2 members of the Guardian's crew to your hand, is a pretty easy 1-star card for me. Now, my history with 1-star cards is fraught. I called Dragon of the Moon a 1-star card. It got buffed by effectively doubled power, and then it wasn't a 1-star card anymore. But even before then, I think you could reasonably say, Cam, you were wrong. That was actually a 2-star card if you really want to split things up and look in like, you know, was it actually in the bottom 20th percentile? The way I think about these cards is roughly and not explicitly, like roughly is the operative word here. A 1-star card is the bottom 20th percentile. A 2-star card is the 20th to 40th. A 3-star card is the 40th to 60th and so on, right? I think Dragon of the Moon was pretty clearly not necessarily in that 0 to 20th percentile range. This is a card that I feel like is, but if I really got down to it, I bet I could argue myself up to being a 2-star card. Either way, I don't think this is a card that is worth going out of your way to acquire. It comes in one of the limited time events in this game, in this season, and it's pretty bad. I don't really expect you to be playing a lot of this. A lot of that is down to this is just a card that doesn't really synergize with stuff in a meaningful way. And what I mean by that is if you want to play a Victoria hand, you have better things that generate small cards, which is what Victoria hand wants to do. And if you want to play Quinjet, you'd probably be better off playing Agent Coulson because then you're at least guaranteeing that you're generating something that Quinjet is actually going to work on rather than a Mantis or a Rocket Raccoon. it's the wideness of the potential outcomes that make this a little bit awkward, I think. And while it might be a little bit better than Agent Coulson, nobody plays Agent Coulson. So I don't really think that's like a meaningful statement in terms of whether or not this card is an actual card that is worth going out of your way to get. This is not a card that is going to help you win games at endgame. It is a card that will immediately be replaced by anything else in almost every deck you put it in and probably improve that deck. I do not recommend you go out of your way to get this card. Feel free to play the game mode and get it for free. That's like the exact perfect thing a card like this should be in. Kraglin is a 3/3 on reveal where he banishes the top card of your deck, and if that card costs 4 or more, you get +2 energy, and if it costs 3 or less, you get +4 power on Kraglin. So it's either 3/7 or some additional energy. I don't know. I've been pretty harsh on this card, but like fundamentally, I do think that the effect is probably a good thing to do. Maybe I will be playing it in some kind of just normal ass deck where it's like, I'm going to make this guy a 3/7 a lot. But the thing is, I think mostly when you put this card in the deck, you're doing it for the energy. And if you're doing it for the energy, you're doing it to do a specific thing with that energy. You want to go from you want to have 6 energy on turn 4, right? A lot of why you want to have 6 energy on turn 4 is related to a specific card that has specific text. I want to have 6 energy on turn 4 so I can Galactus you. I want to have 6 energy on turn 4 so I can play an Onslaught and then play a Sarah the next turn. I care about the cards that are in my deck and what their text says. And so I wonder if this is going to be a meaningful upgrade to that kind of stuff. Because in the case of Galactus, first of all, you'd rather play Wave full stop, because that's a better tool at taking priority and making sure your Galactus goes off. And in the case of something like Living Tribunal, you have so many individual pieces in the deck that you really don't want to be banishing any of them. And I realize that banish being bad for you is mostly a noob trap, right? Like the general heuristic that a good player will tell you is, okay, yeah, it can hit the good card, but it can also draw you closer to the good card. It's actually a wash. Don't worry about it. And that is generally true. But the specific situation that this card is in, i.e., you are putting it in your deck to get +2 energy and do a specific thing on turn 6, I think that really doesn't lend itself to banishing the top card of your deck as a mechanic. Maybe I'm off base, but I do think that it often puts itself in situations where you are going to get your energy, but you are risking the game being over right then, when I'm not even sure why it needs to have that risk involved. I get that it's Yondu flavor. Apparently, this is the character from the Guardians things that was played by Sean Gunn, James Gunn's brother, I believe. You probably recognize that guy. And I get that. I understand that like they're doing a Yondu riff here. Like, oh, okay, it's a banish card off the top of the deck. They're riffing on the Yondu theme. I just don't know that it was necessary in this specific spot. Like, this is going to be a card that goes in decks to get the +2 energy. That would be the reason you put it in your deck. The +4 power is a fallback, I think. I don't think we're super interested in a 3/7 based on everything everyone else has ever told me about Drax. I just kind of wonder if they didn't make a card that feels quite bad to play. I'm going to say this guy is a 2-star card, and frankly, I think I'm being generous. Jack Flag and ongoing with your cards here with increased power get +2 power. Sorry, got distracted a little bit by this thing right here. This is a card that I think is probably pretty good, but it's hard to tell what the range from pretty good to busted is with something like this. My instinct is that I think it's probably a floor of at least a pretty good card. This is a card where you're just like, baseline, my floor here, this is a really solid inclusion in my deck. Ceiling, I want to find something that's actually busted here. Like, I think this is a card that's pretty interesting with something like Aurora, for example. Pretty interesting with cards like Spectrum. Pretty interesting with one of the cards we're going to talk, well, the last remaining card in the season, we got to talk about that when that comes up. Pretty interesting with like board-wide buffs. Pretty interesting with Silver Surfer. There's stuff this card does. It's just that like in a lot of those spaces, there's already really interesting stuff to do with that. Like, is Surfer even a good card in Surfer decks at this point? There is a serious question about that. And I think that there being so much powerful stuff to do in this space is interesting. The one place I think this card actually will shine is in Aurora decks. I think that is like, this is very clearly a thing that benefits from that. And I think that Aurora currently doesn't really have a thing filling this role, where if you look at Surfer, there are a lot of cards that are like, I'm a 311 with Silver Surfer. That's like every Surfer card. There are so many of those that like you kind of just have to look at this and be like, all right, well, what makes you different, right? And for Jack Flag, I think this is like a card that makes sense in Aurora, a card that makes sense in maybe like the Invisible Woman deck, right? Like anything that is doing a decent amount of green power is interested in this, or doing board-wide buffs. So I think this is a pretty good card. I'm willing to buy that it's like a reasonable thing, but I think that mostly it's like a card that goes in tier 2 decks and is pretty good. In tier 2 decks, I'm going to say 3.5 stars, with the potential for this card significantly moving up if there's an interaction that I missed. Starhawk on reveal, odd turns, +1 to all of your cards at the left location, even turns, +1 to all of your cards at the right location. I think this guy's probably good. I think he's good in like a sort of majestic wing beat kind of way, where you're never going to be like, wow, I'm so happy I have Starhawk here, but he's just going to be like a quiet role player in decks that I think is actually, this guy's just going to be a reasonable piece that a lot of what holds back small buff decks like Clea stuff is that they just don't have good enough enablers right now. And we've talked about this with the changes that happened to Shang-Chi, Master of the Rings, that kind of stuff. This guy's kind of like that, where it's like, is this guy perfect? No, but he's like a 2/6 that has real synergy. If you fill up the lane and play him somewhere else, that's +4. You're happy with it. Now, I will say, my understanding of this card is he doesn't need to be at either of those lanes. Like, you play him anywhere, and then he'll give the effect to those lanes. That's how I read it. A couple of people in my comments read it as you had to play him on those lanes in order to get the effect. If he's that, I think he's probably god-awful. But if he's just, like, playing the way he reads, I think this is a very reasonable card. I think this is like a 3.5 star card that, frankly, when you look at Jack Flag, this seems like a card that goes really well with it. Like, that kind of thing seems pretty compelling to me. Just easy ways to get board-wide buffs are going to be really important to your Jack Flag deck, and I think that this is one of the easiest ways to get a board-wide buff in the entire game. So I am pretty high on this. I will say 3.5 stars, and I do think it's interesting that there are no 5-star cards in this season, according to me. I don't really know what that means. Maybe I'm being too harsh on 5-star cards. I've actually been accused of being too lenient on 5-star cards. Like, I said Sholau was a 5-star card when I was talking with Lambie a couple weeks ago on when we did an episode of 8 Cubes, and he was like, I don't know, I feel like that's not really broken enough. Like, Loki's a 5-star card, Sholau might not be. To me, Sholau is a 5-star card. Maybe the floor of 5-star cards, but still a 5-star card. I think Merlin was a 5-star card. Things like that. Those are what my 5-star cards are. I don't see any of those in this season, but I do see some pretty solid cards in there are also, I would say, several whiffs here. I did take a look at my previous video, and I think I'm pretty happy with last month's ratings. I think I was mostly on target for how these cards ended up playing out. I basically buy that I at least was directionally correct with my thinking in those, but I will also say I feel like I was a lot more confident when I recorded that video as to how good these cards were going to be. And recording this video, I feel a lot less confident. I feel like there's a lot of stuff in this season that I look at and I'm like, that's gotta be bad. And then like I think about it more and I'm like, no, I think there's actually something here. I think Star-Lord's a good example of that. I think Starhawk's a good example of that, where it's like, I look at these and I'm like, well, that looks terrible, but oh my God, I have to end this video. My cat is on the desk. She's about to knock over my camera. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.